I'm Saul Becker, Professor of Social Policy and Social Work at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. I'm also Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Head of the College of Social Sciences at Birmingham. I think the first achievement is that young carers have a much greater international recognition than they did, say, 10 years ago. Australia, the UK and a few other countries have led in this in terms of developing services for young carers, promoting them as a specific group. And that's, if you like, caught on in other countries in the world. So the first achievement has been a greater international awareness and recognition of who young carers are and what they do within their families. A second achievement has been around the development of services and responses in some other countries. So it's not just Australia and the UK now which have developed services, but a number of others, including Switzerland, France, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and others are beginning to really focus on the needs of young carers and develop specific services and interventions to meet those needs. A third achievement has been a growing, if you like, recognition of the need for countries to work together to develop research projects. So Eurocarers and others have been developing cross-national research studies to try and do studies of young carers in different countries, living and caring in different kinds of economic and social context to look at the differences and similarities. Another achievement has, to some extent, been the conversations that policymakers and practitioners are actually having across countries to see what works, to see what we can do, what can we take from one country and apply to another national context. And those conversations at conferences and forums and seminars and informal conversations are really important in what we call policy transfer, taking the lessons learned in one country and trying to apply them in another. And finally, the final achievement I'd like to point out is a growing recognition internationally that young carers have specific rights, both as children and as carers. And in some countries, those rights are now enshrined in specific pieces of legislation. And I think that's a real advance. The greatest challenge facing young carers globally is that still most countries don't recognise young carers at all. They are not recognised in policy, they're not recognised in practice, and so they have very little rights or entitlements. In fact, in most countries they have no legal rights or entitlements at all. And this is a real challenge to get countries around the world to recognise the nature and the extent of caregiving amongst children in those countries. The second challenge is that because only a handful or so of countries have specific projects for young carers, they are still neglected in the vast majority of countries in the world. And developing services and responses for those young carers will only follow when those countries have greater recognition and awareness of what children are doing within caregiving families. A further challenge in terms of what has to be achieved is that we really have to improve the research base for young carers. So many countries will only move forward in terms of awareness and developing services when they have some evidence about the extent and nature of caring within those countries. They require, if you like, a research evidence base before they are willing to take action. And so there is a real challenge to get more research and to ensure that that research is of a particular high quality. And in due course, that research needs to be cross-national, comparing one country with another, rather than just specifically within country, looking at one country at a time. The final challenge that I would like to point out at this stage is that we need a reconceptualisation of young carers, not just as children in need, but as children with specific legal rights. Legal rights as children under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also as young people with caring responsibilities. And so we need to push forward within country-specific policy contexts to ensure that young carers are identified as a specific group of young people with specific rights to support and to assistance, not just for them, but for them and their families as well. It's clear that a larger number of countries now are engaging in research on young carers, and they are beginning to say about the extent and nature of caring within those countries, and that's really important to get a sense of the kinds of numbers and proportions of children that are caring within particular countries and regions of the world. We're also finding from the research that there's more research which is indicating the sheer importance of good educational experiences for young carers. Support for children who are carers within schools, within colleges and within universities is so critical to enabling them to move forward on a positive basis rather than being disadvantaged later on. And all the evidence indicates that appropriate support within educational establishments is absolutely central to, if you like, giving young carers a platform for going forward into adulthood, into paid work, into higher education, etc. There's some research which is indicating now the mental health problems of young carers in terms of the consequences and impacts of caring on their psychosocial development, but their mental health and how that can affect them and indeed affect their access to higher education and also to paid work. There are a number of real challenges for the research evidence base, and I'd like to suggest there are three which are critical. The first is the need for greater longitudinal studies. At this stage we don't really have any that are robust and meaningful, and what we need to do is track young carers through the life course to identify what the long-term outcomes and impacts are of caring, not just in childhood, but also into transitions to adulthood and then into adulthood. The second challenge is about conducting studies which are robust in terms of evaluations, looking at what works, looking at the evidence about particular interventions and seeing what works and why they work. And the third challenge is around cross-national studies. What can we learn from other countries? What can we learn from one country in terms of what it's done and apply that to another country so that we don't constantly reinvent the wheel? So these are the challenges for the research evidence base going forward.